You're about to hear one of the most brutal, terrifying, and genuinely unbelievable survival stories in maritime history. 15 men. A barren, freezing rock in the middle of nowhere. 7 months. No tools. No rescue coming. Welcome to Audiobook 28, where every story we tell is earned in blood, salt water, and sheer human willpower. If you're new here, subscribe right now, because this channel is where history's most extreme survival stories get told the way they deserve. Hit that button. You won't regret it. Now, let's get into it. Section 2, Topic Intro. March, 1907. Pitch black. A massive steel four-masted bark called the Dundonald is hammering through one of the most violent stretches of ocean on the entire planet. The officers don't know exactly where they are. Their compass has been acting strange for days, and the sky has been so choked with clouds that they haven't been able to take a proper reading of the stars. Then, at around 2 in the morning, without any warning at all, the Dundonald drives full speed into the sheer 300-foot cliffs of Disappointment Island. Men are thrown from their bunks, from the rigging, from the deck. Some are killed instantly. Others plunge into the freezing black ocean and try to swim toward sounds they can barely hear over the roar of the waves and the grinding of the breaking ship. The men who survive do so by clinging to the sheer rock face with bleeding fingers, pulling themselves up inch by inch while the ocean tries to drag them back down into the dark. 28 men were on that ship when it left port. Only 15 make it to the top of those cliffs alive. Now here's the thing that should genuinely stop you cold. Those 15 men will survive on this desolate rock for 7 months, with no tools, almost no food, and no way to light a fire, eating raw seabirds and sleeping in holes they dug into the peat with their bare hands just to stay warm enough not to die. And then, impossibly, they will build a boat out of scrub branches and scavenged canvas from the wreck and sail it across miles of one of the world's most violent oceans to find rescue. This is not a story about luck. This is a story about what human beings are capable of when death is the only alternative to trying. I am going to walk you through every single nightmare these men lived through, the wreck, the starvation, the cold, the despair, the impossible boat, and the final rescue. By the end of this, you will understand exactly why historians consider the ordeal of the Dundonald castaways one of the most remarkable survival stories ever documented. But let me ask you something before we go any further. If you woke up tomorrow on a barren, freezing rock in the middle of the sub-Antarctic Ocean with no tools, no fire, no food, and no way to call for help, what is the first decision you make? And would you have the guts to make the right one? Keep that question in your head. Let's go back to where this all begins.
Section 3. The Main Story. Segment 1. The Doomed Voyage. There is a particular kind of dread that builds slowly at sea. Not the sudden shock of a wave breaking over the bow or a rope snapping in a squall, but the creeping bone-deep certainty that something is wrong and that there is absolutely nowhere to go. The Dundonald departed from Sydney, Australia, in the early months of 1907, loaded with cargo and crewed by 28 men. She was a steel four-masted bark, a massive, serious vessel, built for exactly the kind of hard-weather ocean passages that made sailors wealthy and made shipping companies their fortunes. Her route was a common one for the era, down into the Southern Ocean, rounding the bottom of the world, and heading toward the markets of Europe. It was not a gentle route. No route through the Southern Ocean ever is. But it was a known route, a manageable one, in theory. The crew were experienced men. Merchant sailors of the early 20th century were not romantics. They were professionals who understood that the sea was a workplace, and a dangerous one. They knew the Southern Ocean had teeth. They knew the latitudes south of 40 degrees, what sailors called the Roaring Forties, and further south, the Furious 50s, were places where storms built with nothing to stop them for thousands of miles, where swells could reach the height of a 4-story building, where the water temperature dropped low enough to kill a man in the water in minutes. They knew all of this. They had sailed it before. and so they set out from Sydney with the practical confidence of men who had done hard things and survived them. But somewhere south of Australia, as the Dundonald pushed deeper into the Southern Ocean, things began to feel wrong. The weather deteriorated in ways that felt relentless rather than episodic. Usually, even in bad latitudes, a ship would catch a window, a patch of clearer sky, a brief reduction in wind that allowed officers to get a proper celestial fix, to confirm their position against the stars or the sun, and update their charts with confidence. But the sky refused to clear. Day after day, the cloud cover stayed thick and low. The sun was invisible. The stars at night were smothered completely. Without celestial navigation, the officers were depending on dead reckoning, a method of estimating position based on known speed, heading, and elapsed time. It sounds precise, but in practice, in heavy weather with strong and unpredictable currents, dead reckoning in the Southern Ocean could put you miles from where you thought you were. And there was something else, something that likely contributed to the tragedy in a way that must have haunted the survivors for the rest of their lives. The compass. By some accounts, the ship's compass was behaving erratically, possibly due to proximity to the iron-heavy geology of the sub-Antarctic islands, possibly due to damage, possibly due to some combination of factors that even now is not entirely certain. What is certain is this: the officers did not know, with any real confidence, exactly where the Dundonald was, and the Dundonald was charging through the darkness at full sailing speed toward an island whose very name, Disappointment, seemed to have been chosen by someone who already knew what was coming. The Auckland Islands lie in the Southern Ocean, roughly 300 miles south of New Zealand's South Island. They are not small. The main island is substantial. But scattered around and near the main island are smaller, brutal outcrops of rock and cliff, and Disappointment Island is among them. It rises almost vertically from the ocean, a wall of ancient basalt and peat, its cliffs sheer and unforgiving. There is almost no beach. There is almost no shelter. There is almost nothing growing on it except tussock grass and a low, dense scrub that barely qualifies as vegetation. And on a black, stormy night in March of 1907, the Dundonald was heading straight for it. Nobody on board knew. The officers were doing their best with the information they had. The helmsman held the course they had been given. The watch continued, and the ship ran on through the dark, her iron hull cutting through swells that were building moment by moment toward catastrophe. The only mercy, if you can call it that, is that there was no warning. There was no long period of terror. One moment the ship was sailing, the next, everything ended. Segment 2. The Wreck. At approximately 2 a.m. on the 6th of March, 1907, the Dundonald hit the cliffs of Disappointment Island at full speed, and the world became noise. The sound of a large iron ship striking rock is not something you can prepare yourself for. It is not a bang. It is a roar, a shrieking, metallic groan. The sound of thousands of tons of iron and cargo and rigging all transferring their momentum into a surface that refuses to give. Below decks, sleeping men were thrown from their bunks with violent, bone-jarring force. On deck, sailors on watch were flung against railings, against rigging, across the heaving planks of a deck that had gone from a stable working surface to a wildly tilting, fragmenting nightmare in the space of a single second. Masts snapped. Rigging came down in tangled cascades of rope and wire and canvas. Cargo broke free. The hull, which had been built to flex and manage the stresses of heavy weather, now received a stress it was never designed to handle, and it began to fail. What followed in those first minutes was the most savage kind of chaos. The kind where individual human decisions get made in fractions of seconds, without any real information, in complete darkness, surrounded by noise so overwhelming it is physically disorienting. Some men who were below decks when the ship struck were simply unable to get out in time. The wreck was happening fast, the ship breaking and settling and being worked by the waves simultaneously. and the passages and ladders that led to the deck became death traps as the hull shifted and water poured in. These men, we do not know exactly how many or exactly which of the 28 met their end this way, were lost in those first terrible minutes. The men who made it to the deck faced a different kind of nightmare. The Dundonald had struck the base of the cliffs, and the waves, already enormous in the storm, were now amplified by the way they bounced and reflected off the rock face, creating a churning, chaotic sea of white water at the ship's sides. The deck was tilting. The ship was breaking apart under the survivors' feet, and directly above them, invisible in the darkness, were those sheer 300-foot cliffs. Below them was the ocean, freezing, violent, and lethal. The only option was up, and up meant the cliffs. Some men tried to launch a lifeboat. In the conditions, darkness, extreme sea state, the ship already broken and moving, this was all but impossible. The boats were damaged, the davits were jammed, and the ocean around the wreck was a killing ground of white water, submerged rocks, and surging swells. Any man who went into that water had seconds, not minutes, before the cold began to shut down his muscles and the waves began to throw him against the rock face like a rag doll. Some men jumped. Some were washed overboard by waves breaking over the ruined deck. Some made it to the rock face and managed to hold on. Others were pulled back by the next wave before they could secure any grip. The captain, a man who, in the tradition of the era, was among the last to try to leave the ship, did not survive. The exact manner of his death is lost to the chaos of those minutes, but he was among the 13 men who did not make it through the night. Some died in the wreck itself. Some drowned in the water at the cliff base. Some, it seems, may have made it partway up the cliff and then lost their grip in the dark. The sea and the cliff and the cold took them, and nobody who survived had time or ability to do anything but keep moving upward. Those 15 survivors who made it to the top of the cliffs did so through a combination of desperation, physical strength, and something that in retrospect looks almost like a selective mercy of the dark. You couldn't see how high you were. You couldn't see what was below you. You could only feel the rock under your fingers and hear the ocean roaring beneath you, and know with absolute animal certainty that you had to keep going up. And so they climbed. They climbed with torn, bleeding hands. They climbed in waterlogged clothes so heavy they could barely lift their own arms. They climbed in the dark, in the rain, in the cold, until finally the rock leveled out, and they collapsed on the tussock grass at the cliff top, and lay there, unable to do anything at all except breathe. 13 men were gone. The ship was breaking apart below them in the dark, and the 15 men lying on the cliff top of Disappointment Island had absolutely no idea what they had just survived into. Segment 3. The First Morning. Dawn in the sub-Antarctic does not arrive with warmth. It arrives like an accusation. As the gray light grew strong enough for the 15 survivors to see their surroundings, what they saw was not encouraging. Disappointment Island is, in almost every physical sense, spectacularly unsuited for human survival. It has no trees, not a single one. The island is essentially a plateau of peat and tussock grass, fringed by those sheer cliffs, surrounded entirely by ocean. The vegetation that exists is low scrub, dense, twisted, almost woody in places, but never growing more than a few feet high. There are birds, albatrosses in enormous numbers, as well as other seabirds. There are seals on the lower rocks, but there is no fresh water that is immediately obvious, no shelter that isn't made from the land itself, and, critically, devastatingly, absolutely no wood. No driftwood, no fallen timber, nothing that burns. The men took stock. What did they have? The clothes on their backs, most of them soaking wet, some of them torn in the wreck or the climb. A few men had managed in the chaos of the wreck to grab small personal items, but nothing useful in any systematic survival sense. There were no tools, no knives to speak of, no rope, no containers for water, and the most critical absence of all, no means of making fire. Some accounts suggest a few matches existed among the group, waterlogged, mostly ruined. The prospect of getting a fire going was grim. The prospect of sustaining one on an island with no fuel was grimmer still. The temperature on Disappointment Island in March, which is the beginning of the southern autumn, heading toward winter, hovers around freezing. The wind is almost constant, and wind chill in those conditions can make the effective temperature feel dramatically colder. Wet clothes in those temperatures do not dry. They wick away body heat continuously. The men, most of whom were already soaked to the skin from the wreck, were now in a race against hypothermia, and they didn't have a good hand to play. But among the 15 was a quality that the survival literature often calls leadership under pressure. And in the case of the Dundonald survivors, it manifested quickly in the form of the ship's first mate, a man named Jabez Peters. Peters was not a man given to panic or despair. He understood, as clearly as any man there, how bad their situation was. He also understood, crucially, that if they did not organize immediately, the combination of shock, cold, and despair would begin to kill them before the island got the chance. So almost from the very first morning, the survivors were organized into a working unit. Not because it was comfortable, not because anyone felt like working, but because the alternative was dying. The first priorities were shelter, warmth, and water. Shelter was solved in a grim and claustrophobic way. They dug. The peat on Disappointment Island, while cold and damp, is thick, sometimes several feet deep, and it can be excavated with bare hands and improvised tools scraped together from the wreck. The men dug holes and trenches in the peat, crawling into them and piling tussock grass over themselves as insulation. It was dark, it was damp, it smelled of earth and decay. But inside those holes, packed together in groups, body heat could accumulate, and the wind, which above ground was life-threatening in wet clothing, was reduced to something survivable. It was not comfort, but it was the difference between living and dying, and the survivors accepted it with the practicality of men who no longer had the luxury of preferences. And food. The albatrosses were the first answer. These great birds, which nest on the Auckland Island group in massive numbers, have an unfortunate quality from a survival perspective. They are not afraid of humans. They had never been hunted by humans on Disappointment Island, and so they sat and watched the castaways approach with something close to curiosity. This made them catchable. It made them the difference between life and starvation. But catching an albatross and eating a raw albatross, because at this point there was no fire, are experiences that the survivors described in terms that make clear it was one of the most wretched things any of them had ever done. These are large, powerful birds. They bite and fight, and their flesh, consumed raw, is oily, fishy, and deeply unpleasant. But it contained calories, and calories were survival. So the men ate. This was day one. They had no way to know how many more days like this were coming. They had no way to know if anyone would ever come looking for them. They had no way to know if Disappointment Island was going to be their grave. What they had was each other, and the discipline that Peters was already beginning to impose, and the absolute refusal to stop moving. That refusal, that daily, grinding, unglamorous act of choosing to keep going, is what this story is really about. Segment 4. Starvation and Survival. If you want to understand what 7 months on Disappointment Island actually felt like, you have to understand cold. Not the cold of a chilly day or a bad winter in a city where there are buildings and heating and the option of going inside. Real cold, the kind these men lived in every single day for 7 months, is a constant antagonist. It never fully goes away. Even on the relatively less brutal days, the temperature in the Auckland Islands region during winter sits close to or below freezing. Wind is nearly always present, and as any sailor or mountaineer knows, wind does not just add to cold, it multiplies it. In wet clothing, which the survivors often were because the island's weather frequently brought rain and sea spray, the heat loss from the human body accelerates dramatically. The men were burning enormous amounts of calories just to maintain their core temperature, and they had very limited calories available. The albatrosses were critical in the early period. The birds were catchable, they were large enough to provide meaningful nutrition, and they were available in significant numbers. The men became expert at catching them, developing efficient methods born of desperate practice. But eating raw bird, oily, fishy, and bloody, day after day, without any seasoning, without any variation, without any warmth, takes a toll on a person that goes beyond the physical. The human relationship with food is deeply psychological. Food is comfort, community, normalcy. Eating raw seabird over a wet peat hole in a howling wind is the negation of all of that. It is fuel, only fuel. And the human mind, deprived of comfort and normalcy for extended periods, begins to suffer in ways that the physical body does not immediately show. Seals were also available on the lower rocks, a more substantial food source, and crucially, their skins would later become vital for warmth. But hunting seals without proper tools is exhausting and dangerous work. A large bull seal is a powerful, aggressive animal, and approaching one on a slippery rock ledge above a crashing ocean, armed with nothing but improvised clubs made from driftwood or wreck debris, is not a safe occupation. The men did it anyway, because they had to. The seal meat was eaten raw at first, then, once fire was established, cooked. The fat was rendered for oil. The skins were cured and fashioned into rough garments as their original clothing deteriorated. Fresh water was found, springs or seeps in the peat, in places where the terrain allowed them to collect rainwater. The Auckland Islands received substantial rainfall, which was both a curse and a blessing. The rain kept them wet and cold, but it also kept them from dying of thirst. And on an island with no streams or lakes immediately accessible to them, that rainfall was life. They learned to collect it systematically, using whatever containers they could improvise from wreck salvage. As the weeks turned to months, the physical changes in the men became significant and visible. They grew thinner, not gradually, but relentlessly. The men who had boarded the Dundonald in Sydney as healthy, capable seamen were becoming gaunt figures, their cheekbones prominent, their eyes deepening in hollow sockets, their clothes hanging off them, and then being replaced, piece by piece, with crudely fashioned garments of sealskin and canvas. Their beards grew long and matted. Their hands were permanently damaged, cracked and calloused and scarred from the work of survival, from the cold, from the constant contact with salt water and rough rock and raw meat. They began to look like what they were becoming, men living at the absolute margins of what the human body can sustain. And yet they kept going. The daily routine that Peters maintained, even when it was brutal to maintain, even when the men resisted it, was the invisible infrastructure of their survival. Tasks were assigned. Hunting parties went out. Someone was always maintaining whatever fire they had. Someone was always improving the shelters. Someone was always watching the horizon, scanning for a ship that never came. That last job, the watching, was both necessary and psychologically punishing, because every empty horizon was a small death of hope. And there were a lot of empty horizons. Segment 5. The Fire. Before we go any further, if this story is hitting you the way it's hitting me, go subscribe to Audiobook 28 right now. We cover stories like this every week. Stories about real human beings pushed beyond what any of us think we could handle. Hit that subscribe button and you won't miss a single one. Now, Fire. Of all the challenges the castaways faced in those first terrible days, none was more immediately urgent than the problem of fire. Without fire, they could not cook their food, which limited the nutritional range of what they could eat and increased the risk of illness from raw meat. Without fire, they could not dry their clothing, which meant the cold was a constant and unmanageable threat. Without fire, they had no way to signal a passing ship. Without fire, they were simply surviving in the most bare and brutal sense, enduring rather than building any sustainable existence. The matches that some men had on their persons when the ship went down were, as we noted, mostly ruined. Salt water and match heads are incompatible. But there were a few that had survived in some protected way, tucked deep in a pocket, sheltered from the worst of the soaking. And these became treasures of almost unimaginable value. Each one was treated with the reverence of a precious stone. The question was not just whether they could light with these matches, but what they would burn. Because Disappointment Island has no wood. None. Not a stick. What they had was peat, and the dense, low scrub that grew across the island's plateau. Neither is an ideal fuel. Peat, when thoroughly dry, will burn, slowly, smokily, but persistently. The scrub, dried out, could provide enough heat to start the peat going. But in the sub-Antarctic, in autumn and winter, getting either fuel to a state dry enough to burn is a significant undertaking. And maintaining a fire once it was started, finding enough fuel, protecting it from the wind and rain, keeping it going continuously so they didn't have to light it again, became one of the central preoccupations of the entire 7-month ordeal. When the fire finally caught, when the scrub and dried tussock grass and carefully prepared peat accepted a flame and held it, when that flame grew from a fragile flicker into something real, something that radiated actual heat, the survivor's reaction was one of the moments in this story that is most human and most moving. These were tough men. Merchant sailors of the early 20th century were not given to demonstrating emotion openly. But by every account, the moment they got a real fire going, it broke through every layer of professionalism and stoicism these men had. There were tears. There was laughter. The slightly unhinged laughter of relief so profound it feels like madness. There was the simple animal joy of warmth, of hands extended toward a flame, of heat touching faces that had been cold for weeks. But here is what makes this moment not just heartwarming, but terrifying in retrospect. They could never fully afford to let that fire go out. Every time rain was threatening to overwhelm their windbreak, every time the peat supply ran low, every time the wind was particularly fierce and the flames guttered and nearly died, it was a crisis, because relighting it would require another precious match, and they did not have many. And once those matches were gone, getting fire again would depend on methods, friction-based fire starting, that are brutally difficult in cold, wet conditions, even with properly prepared materials and years of practice. They were not practitioners of primitive survival skills. They were sailors. So the fire had to live. And keeping it alive became a job they guarded with the seriousness of a watch at the helm in a gale. Segment 6. The Brink of Madness. There is a pattern interrupt moment I want you to sit with, because this is the part of the story that the survival adventure genre often glosses over, but it is, in some ways, the most important part. Physical survival is hard. We've established that. But human beings can endure extraordinary physical hardship as long as they have a reason to keep going. What breaks people is not usually cold or hunger or physical pain, it's meaninglessness. It's the moment when a person looks at their situation and cannot construct any convincing narrative in which things get better. That is the moment when people stop. And on Disappointment Island, as the weeks stretched into months with no sign of rescue, some of the 15 survivors began to reach that moment. The name of their prison didn't help. Disappointment Island. Whoever named it, and it was named long before our castaways arrived, named it honestly. The island had disappointed explorers who came seeking a safe harbor or resources, and found neither. It was a name that seemed to reach out of the past and tell these 15 men exactly what was going to happen to them. And human psychology, in extremis, latches on to things like that. The wrong kind of thinking This place was named for failure, and that is what we will find here. Can become a self-fulfilling prophecy if the right kind of leadership doesn't push back against it. Tensions among the men were, by any realistic assessment, inevitable. 15 people in extreme conditions on a tiny island with nothing to do except survive, with no privacy, no personal space, no variation in routine, no real hope yet of rescue, will find things to argue about. Resources, fairness, who was working harder, who was eating more than their share, who made a decision that cost them something. The accumulated frustrations and fears and grief of their situation. And there was grief, real grief, for the 13 men who died in the wreck, some of whom were friends, some of whom were family to each other in the way that men who go to sea together become. All of that needed somewhere to go, and sometimes it went sideways, into conflict. Peters worked constantly against this. The daily routine he maintained was not just practical, it was psychological engineering. And quite sophisticated psychological engineering for a man who had no formal training in any of it and was operating on instinct and necessity. By keeping men busy, by giving each person a defined role and a specific responsibility, he prevented the kind of idle inward spiral that kills group cohesion. Work has meaning. Even when the work is exhausting and grim, it provides structure. Structure provides purpose. Purpose keeps people getting up in the morning when every instinct says to lie down and stop. But leadership has limits, and some of the men were simply wearing out, not just physically, though that was happening too, but in some deeper way that the language of early 20th century sailors didn't have great vocabulary for. What we would now recognize as depression and prolonged psychological stress was manifesting in men who grew quieter, who moved more slowly, who lost the edge of alertness and focus that survival requires. Peters and the stronger members of the group would have had to manage this carefully, encouraging without condescending, pushing without breaking, creating small victories and small moments of normalcy in a situation that was relentlessly abnormal. And then, somewhere in the dark stretch of the sub-Antarctic winter, the calculation changed. Because the men, slowly, collectively, arrived at a realization that was both terrifying and clarifying. Nobody was coming for them. Not because anyone had failed them, but because nobody knew where to look. A ship wrecked in the Southern Ocean was a ship that simply didn't arrive at its destination, and ships that didn't arrive were mourned, and their crew were listed as lost, and life moved on. If the castaways of the Dundonald were going to be rescued, they were going to have to rescue themselves. And to do that, they were going to need a plan that should, by any rational assessment, have been impossible. Segment 7. The Desperate Plan. The Auckland Islands, as a group, were known in the maritime world as a place where ships sometimes wrecked. And because ships wrecked there, because the Auckland Islands lay in the path of vessels rounding the southern tip of the world and had those sheer, unforgiving cliffs and that violent, unpredictable weather, the New Zealand government had established a system of castaway depots on the main Auckland Island. These were stocked shelters containing food, preserved provisions that could sustain survivors for extended periods, clothing, tools, and crucially, a means of signaling ships. The main Auckland Island also had a more accessible coastline, and vessels did occasionally visit to check on the depots and look for survivors. If you were stranded on the main Auckland Island, your chances of eventual rescue, while not guaranteed, were meaningfully better than if you were stranded on Disappointment Island, which was smaller, more remote, harder to approach by sea, and almost certainly not on the regular patrol route. The problem was the distance. Disappointment Island is separated from the main Auckland Island by several miles of open ocean that in this part of the world is rarely calm and sometimes murderous. The strait between the islands would see strong currents, significant swells, and unpredictable winds. To cross it, you would need a seaworthy vessel. The survivors had no vessel. Their ship was in pieces at the base of the cliffs. The lifeboats were gone or destroyed in the wreck. They had nothing that floated intentionally. But they had something else. They had men who collectively understood the sea and understood boats, and they had the intelligence to look at what was available on the island and ask the question, what could we build? The answer, when they arrived at it, was a coracle. A coracle is one of the most ancient forms of watercraft in human history, a round or oval boat with a frame of flexible material covered by a waterproof skin. The Welsh used them. The ancient Irish used them. They are small, they are simple, and they are genuinely capable in the right hands, in calm water. The critical material requirements are a flexible frame, wood, branches, or withies, and a waterproof covering, traditionally animal skin or tar-treated fabric. On Disappointment Island, they had neither in ideal form, but they had the dense, flexible scrub that grew across the island's plateau, and they had canvas, sail canvas, salvaged from the wreck, retrieved from the cliff base at enormous personal risk by men who climbed down and searched through the debris that the tides had piled against the rocks. The plan was audacious. It was arguably insane by the safety standards of any world other than the one these men currently inhabited. A coracle built from island scrub and salvaged canvas, paddled by exhausted, malnourished men across several miles of violent sub-Antarctic ocean. If it worked, they could reach the main island, find the depot, get supplies, and then either wait for rescue or somehow signal a passing vessel. If it didn't work, if the coracle swamped or broke apart or capsized in the channel, the men in it would be dead in minutes. The water temperature alone guaranteed that. But staying on Disappointment Island and waiting for a rescue that logic suggested would never come was also a form of death, just a slower one. So they committed. They were going to build a boat out of twigs and old canvas, and they were going to sail it across one of the world's most dangerous stretches of ocean. And somehow, impossibly, it was going to have to work. Segment 8. Building the Coracle. The construction of the coracle was not quick, and it was not simple. The scrub branches of Disappointment Island are not ideal boat-building material. They are irregular, they vary in thickness and flexibility, and they are not the sort of timber that a shipwright would choose for anything they intended to float in serious water. But desperate ingenuity is a remarkable thing. The men selected the longest, most flexible branches they could find, soaking them where necessary to increase their pliability, bending them into the oval hull form of the coracle, and lashing them together with rope salvaged from the wreck. Every lashing point, every junction in the frame was a potential failure point, a place where the frame could flex apart under stress or catch water and tear. Every lashing was therefore done with the care of a man who knew that sloppiness here meant drowning there. The canvas covering was the other great engineering challenge. The canvas sections salvaged from the wreck were not in pristine condition. Salt water, rocks, and time had damaged them, and the sections they had were not necessarily the right shape or size for what they needed. They had to be cut, fitted, and joined together in a way that would minimize seams, because every seam was a potential leak, and then sealed. Sealing, in the absence of proper caulking materials or tar, required improvisation. Seal blubber, rendered into oil and applied to the canvas, provided some waterproofing. The stitching of canvas sections was done with improvised needles, possibly fashioned from wire or metal salvage, and whatever thread or fine cordage they could produce. It was painstaking work, done by men with damaged hands, in cold conditions that made fine motor control difficult and unreliable. Throughout the building process, there was ongoing debate, sometimes heated, sometimes resigned, about whether this was going to work at all. Some of the men were deeply skeptical. A boat built from island scrub and salvaged canvas, in the hands of men who were significantly weaker and lighter than they had been when they arrived, who were functionally starving, attempting to cross a channel of open ocean in the sub-Antarctic. It required a particular kind of willful self-deception to believe it would succeed. Or alternatively, it required the clear-eyed understanding that the alternative was certainly death, and this was at least possibly not death, and that possibility was worth any attempt. When the coracle was finally finished, When the last lashing was tightened, the last canvas section sealed, and the improvised paddles were prepared, the men gathered around it and looked at it in silence for a long moment. It was small. It was ugly. It was a testament to the limits of what can be built from almost nothing by exhausted, half-starved men. It was also, in its way, extraordinary. Evidence of a refusal to stop that was more impressive than anything any of these men had done in their professional seafaring lives. They had built a boat from almost literally nothing on a rock in the middle of the Southern Ocean. It might kill them, but they had built it. The question of who would make the crossing was not simple. The Coracle was small. It could carry perhaps 3 or 4 men safely, or perhaps not safely, but physically. More than that, and the freeboard, the gap between the waterline and the rim of the boat, would be dangerously low. Too low in those waters, and any wave would swamp her. So a small group would go. They would be the best swimmers among the fittest of the survivors, men who had the best chance of managing the crossing, and if things went catastrophically wrong, of lasting the longest in the water. This selection was its own kind of cruelty, because it meant the rest, the weaker, the more exhausted, would stay behind on Disappointment Island and wait, with no certainty that the men in the Coracle would make it, and no timeline for how long they might wait. Segment 9. The Crossing. The morning they launched was not a good morning, because on Disappointment Island, good mornings were a rare luxury. But they had watched the weather long enough to recognize a window, a period where the wind, while not gentle, was somewhat more manageable than usual, and the direction was workable for their crossing. They had learned to read this island's weather the way a prisoner learns to read his jailer's moods. They took their window. They got the Coracle down to the water, a terrifying process in itself, lowering that fragile thing down the cliff face to the rock ledge at the base, and they launched. The moment the Coracle left the shelter of the cliff base and entered open water, everything changed. On Disappointment Island, surrounded by cliffs, the water at the base was chaotic, but somewhat contained. In the open channel, the swells were fuller, long, slow mountains of dark water that lifted the tiny Coracle to their crests and then sent it sliding down into the troughs, where the next swell was already building. Each time a swell crested, the men could see, briefly, the main Auckland Island on the horizon, and each time the Coracle slid back into the trough, they could see nothing but walls of gray water. The Coracle was taking water. It was not catastrophic, not yet, but every wave that broke over the bow added weight, and the men had to bail continuously with their hands or with improvised containers while simultaneously paddling. The coordination required was enormous. Stop paddling to bail and you lose direction, and in these conditions, losing direction could put you broadside to the swells, which in a Coracle is a death sentence, because a broadside swell rolls you over without apology. Keep paddling, and the water level inside rises. It was a constant, exhausting, terrifying balance, and every moment of it was conducted in the certain knowledge that if anything went significantly wrong, there was no rescue available. Nobody was coming for them. The men on the island couldn't help them. There were no other ships. It was just the Coracle and the ocean and whatever reserves of strength and determination they had left. We don't have a minute-by-minute account of the crossing, and perhaps it's better that way, because what we do have conveys the essential truth of it, which is that it was one of the most harrowing hours, or hours plural, that any of these men ever experienced. At some point, through the combined effort of paddling and bailing and refusing to capsize and refusing to give up, the main Auckland Island grew from a dark smear on the horizon to a real, solid, present thing. Cliffs that were larger and more forgiving than Disappointment Islands. A coastline that, while still wild, had features that suggested the possibility of landing. And somewhere on that island, a government depot with food, clothing, and the tools of potential survival. They landed. The Coracle was hauled up onto the rocks, and the men who climbed out of it did so on legs that were shaking from cold, exhaustion, and the accumulated stress of everything they'd just done. But they were alive. They were on a new island, and somewhere ahead of them was a depot. Segment 10. The Depot. Here is your pattern interrupt, and it is this. Stop for a moment and calculate what you have just heard. These men had been on Disappointment Island for months. They had been surviving on raw and then cooked seabirds and seals. They had been cold every day. They had watched 13 of their crewmates die and had no choice but to keep going. And now a handful of them had just crossed miles of sub-Antarctic ocean in a boat they built from sticks and old canvas. And they needed to find a box of supplies hidden somewhere on an island they had never been to, with no map, no GPS, no guide, just the general knowledge that somewhere on the Auckland Islands there was a castaway depot, because the New Zealand government had put one there. The scale of what remained to be done was not small, but it was less impossible than what they had already survived. The main Auckland Island is not a small place, and the terrain is genuinely difficult. Tussock and scrub and wet peat, hills and valleys, the ever-present wind, and the constant threat of losing direction in an environment with no landmarks a stranger would recognize. The men searched. They moved along the coast where possible, because the depot, if its purpose was to be found by castaways coming off the ocean, would logically be near the coast or visible from a ship. Their bodies were at the far end of their reserves. They had crossed the channel on adrenaline and necessity, and every step now was an act of will over a body that wanted very badly to stop. And then they found it. The government castaway depot on the Auckland Islands was a simple structure, a small building or stout box, well built and stocked against the possibility of exactly this scenario. Shipwrecked sailors, alone and without resources, finding their way to this island. Inside was preserved food, biscuits, tinned provisions, items that would seem completely unremarkable in any normal context, but that to these men, after months of raw seabird and seal meat, were an almost unimaginable luxury. There were also warm clothing, dry clothing, clean clothing, and tools, and fire-starting materials, and the infrastructure of basic human survival provided by other human beings who had understood that men like this might one day need exactly this. There was food, there was warmth, there were dry clothes. After everything, after the wreck, the cliffs, the cold, the starvation, the fire struggle, the building of the Coracle, the crossing, there was a place that felt, in some tiny but profound way, like the first step back toward the world of the living. The men rested. They ate. They began to recover enough to think about the next problem: how to signal for rescue, and how to get back for the men still waiting on Disappointment Island. Segment 11. The Rescue of the Rest. Now, subscribe to Audiobook 28 right now, because we are closing in on the ending of one of history's most extraordinary survival stories. We cover stories that need to be told, stories that don't get the attention they deserve. Subscribe. Don't miss what's coming. The men on Disappointment Island were waiting. That waiting was its own particular hell, not the active, working hell of the earlier months, but a suspended hell of not knowing. Had the Coracle made it? Were the men who crossed alive? Was anyone coming? The horizon was as empty as it had always been. The days passed, the fire was maintained, the hunting continued, and they waited. The rescue of the remaining castaways on Disappointment Island was eventually effected, not by a return trip in the Coracle, but by the arrival of a vessel. The New Zealand government steamer Hinamoa, which made periodic runs to check on the castaway depots of the sub-Antarctic islands, was the instrument of their salvation. The men who had crossed to the main island were found and taken aboard, and the Hinamoa then proceeded to Disappointment Island to retrieve the men still waiting there. The sight of a real ship approaching those cliffs, A real, powered, crewed vessel coming specifically for them must have been one of the most overwhelming experiences of those men's lives. After 7 months of empty horizons, here was a ship. Here was rescue. Here was the world of the living coming back for them. Getting men off Disappointment Island by boat was not simple, given those cliffs and the sea conditions, but the crew of the Hinamoa were experienced in these waters and knew the challenges. Boats were lowered. The castaways were helped down from their cliff top to the water, and one by one, those gaunt, bearded, hollow-eyed men in their patchwork of original sailor clothing and sealskin and canvas, they were brought aboard. The Hinamoa's crew, seeing these men, seeing the state they were in, would have understood immediately what they were looking at. People who had been pushed to the very edge of what human beings can survive, and who had, against all odds, not gone over it. 7 months. 15 men survived. All 15 of them. In a situation where every factor, the violence of the wreck, the climate, the lack of resources, the isolation, the psychological pressure, should reasonably have produced a significantly smaller number of survivors, or none at all. They all made it. That is the fact at the center of this story that is almost impossible to fully absorb. Segment 12. The Final Toll. Let's pause here, because this is the moment that Herbert Escott Inman, in his book, and every honest account of this ordeal, demands that we stop and actually reckon with what these 15 men went through. It is very easy, in a summary like this, in any narrative about survival, to focus on the action and the events and arrive at the rescue as if it were an uncomplicated happy ending. But the reality of what these men had lived through does not resolve cleanly into a happy ending. The physical damage alone was significant. 7 months of nutritional deprivation leaves a body in a state that takes months or years to fully recover from, if it ever does. The cold, the physical labor, the injuries from the wreck, and the daily grind of survival work, these things leave marks. Some of the men would carry physical consequences of Disappointment Island for the rest of their lives. And the psychological toll. We have far better language for this now than anyone in 1907 had. We know that prolonged survival situations, the combination of trauma, grief, fear, isolation, and helplessness, produce psychological damage that is real and lasting. Some of the survivors would have processed what happened on that island for the rest of their lives. The nightmares that come from the sounds of a ship breaking apart in the dark. The grief for the 13 men who didn't make it. The particular, strange guilt that survival sometimes produces in people who have watched others die when they did not. But here is the other truth, the one that this story ultimately insists upon. 15 men looked at everything that was trying to kill them. They looked at it clearly, and they refused. Every single day, for 7 months, they refused. They kept the fire going. They kept hunting. They kept building. They kept organizing and planning and working and hoping, even when hope made no rational sense. And then a handful of them got into a boat made of sticks and sailed it across open ocean and found a depot and brought rescue home. That is not luck. That is not accident. That is a decision made every single morning to still be alive by the evening. Made 212 times in a row. The Dundonald disaster and the survival of its castaways was documented, investigated, and eventually published in Herbert Escott Inman's account. It sits in a tradition of Southern Ocean survival literature, alongside other extraordinary stories, but it stands out because of the specificity of what the survivors accomplished. The Coracle, that boat of sticks and canvas. In a long history of desperate improvisation at sea, very few episodes match the sheer brazenness of that solution. These men built a boat from almost nothing, and it worked. And that is the measure of them. Section 4. Outro. And so we return to where we started. March 1907. Pitch black night. A massive steel ship driving full speed into 300-foot cliffs in the dark. Men thrown from their bunks, from the rigging, from the deck, plunging into freezing water and fighting their way up a sheer rock face with bleeding fingers while their ship broke apart beneath them. 15 men made it to the top, and 7 months later, all 15 of them came home. Here is the plain truth that this story insists upon. The human capacity to endure, adapt, and refuse to stop is not a quality that belongs to a special category of extraordinary people. It is something that lives in ordinary people, who are put in extraordinary circumstances and choose, every single day, to still be alive by nightfall. Now here is my question for you, and I want you to think about it seriously before you answer in the comments. Would you have gotten into that Coracle, that fragile, leaking boat of scrub branches and patched canvas, and paddled it across miles of freezing, violent sub-Antarctic ocean with no guarantee of surviving the crossing? Or would you have stayed on the island, keeping the fire going, and trusted that rescue would eventually come? There is no wrong answer, but I want your honest one. Tell me in the comments, because I genuinely want to know what you'd choose when death is the price of the wrong decision. This has been Audiobook 28, and if you made it all the way here, you already know this channel is your kind of place. Subscribe if you haven't already, and hit that notification bell, because the next story we tell is going to be every bit as unbelievable as this one. Thank you, genuinely, for spending this time with these 15 men and the island that tried and failed to break them. Because the ocean takes many men, but it did not take these ones.